make a start.
Okay.
Welcome everybody to today's Critical Public Conversation webinar. Before we do anything else today, I'm going to invite Auntie Georgina Nicholson to welcome us to country. Poor Auntie Georgina has had some big internet struggles this morning, but she's very kindly joining us on the phone. So please listen attentively as Auntie Georgina welcomes us to country. Thank you so much, Auntie Georgina. That was, as always, a really beautiful welcome from you. The love and support we've had from the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung clan, and particularly the elders over the last couple of years, as Auntie Georgina says, maintaining these connections, even when we are in online environments, has been crucially important to the work that we've done, keeping us grounded, keeping us centred in our focus on promoting and recognising Indigenous sovereignty. So thank you, Auntie Georgina.
Thank you very much.
Just so lovely to hear your voice. I'm only sorry we didn't see your beautiful face. Next time. And my throat was going silly then when I was talking. Well,
I thought that was going to break up then, but it's all right. Thank you so much for today, ladies. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye. Yeah, bye.
That was a beautiful welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us today. A couple of tiny housekeeping matters before I introduce our speaker today. So the chat function is disabled for this webinar, but we will be taking your questions through the Q&A function. You can pop your questions into the Q&A chat function anytime during the webinar. And then once Liz Strakosch has finished her presentation, I will feed her the questions from that chat. We should have around 15 minutes left at the end, roughly. So thanks everyone. I'm now going to introduce the wonderful Liz Strakosch. You may have recalled that we were scheduled to have two presenters today. Dr. Alyssa McCown was going to present with Liz. Alyssa is unfortunately, like so many people at the moment, grappling with illness and so isn't able to join us, but I'm going to read her bio anyway because her collaboration with Liz Strakosch is long and meaningful, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work and their work together. So Alyssa McCown is a director of the Institute for Collaborative Race Research. She's a white woman interested in the politics of race and contemporary colonialism, and in particular, the ways in which race is deployed in Australia to entrench colonial relations of rule. Alyssa's work draws on scholarship from public policy, political theory, settler colonial studies, sociology, critical race and critical Indigenous studies. Alyssa is also a chief investigator on the Australian Research Council Indigenous grant focused on building an Indigenous health humanities. So Alyssa has co-authored today's presentation with the presenter, who I will now introduce, Dr. Elizabeth Strakosch, who is a senior lecturer in public policy and governance at the University of Queensland, and her work focuses on Indigenous policy, colonialism, political relationships, bureaucracy, and new public management. Her research explores the connection between political relationships and policy systems in Australia and other settler contexts. Liz is a non-Indigenous scholar who aims to carry out politically located research that respects Indigenous sovereignty. Liz is currently working with me and others on an ARC project called Revitalising Indigenous State Relations, and is also developing a comparative study of Australia and US Indigenous policy relations. So I'm going to hand over to Liz now for her presentation, and I'll be back at the end to manage a Q&A session. Thanks, Liz.
I'm just going to share my screen. Does that look okay, Sarah?
Perfect. Thanks, Liz.
Okay. I'd like to begin by thanking Auntie Georgina Nicholson for her really generous welcome to country, and to thank Sarah and the Australia Centre for having me here, and all of you who have joined and given your time. I'd especially like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who've joined, and I look forward to everyone's engagement with these ideas that we're going to discuss today and their usefulness. Alyssa and I want to begin by locating ourselves. So I'm going to use the language of we. Alyssa is metaphorically here. Obviously, she's very apologetic that she can't be here in person, but this work is very much from our joint thinking, so I'm going to speak in that way. We're speaking to you from a place, and we'd like to locate ourselves in that place. It is a house that we call Southside House in Woolloongabba in Brisbane in Queensland. Before it was this suburb with these streets, it was Yagara land, and it remains Yagara land today. There's fresh water flowing underground nearby. There's a really important gathering place for the 16 local nations nearby down the road. There's terrible sites of colonial violence up on the cliffs. 2 blocks away is the regional police station and the old jail. The Yagara people, like the rest of the 16 nations, are still here, and their sovereign energy and the sovereign energy of the land is in this place. Southside House is named also because it's on the south side of Brisbane, which is the racialised side of town. Historically, Black people were banned from going north of the river, and even in the late 20th century, there were curfews that operated for non-white folk to retreat behind nearby Boundary Street. Brisbane South Side is the side of Inala, the powerful contemporary Indigenous community, and of Logan as well, which is a diverse and often vilified council area on Brisbane outskirts that Brisbane Northerners like to make jokes about, and that is often used as a kind of testing ground from the government for things like coercive welfare and school attendance measures. Here in Woolloongabba and in nearby West End and also in Inala are really important sites and powerful sites for Aboriginal activism, sovereignty and survival, including some of the genesis of the Aboriginal community controlled sector in the 70s. So just as Southside House, which is a collective space that's kind of facilitated by an organisation called the Institute for Collaborative Race Research, just as it was formed in a place, it was also formed in a time and in a particular moment of time, which was the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. This moment is both exceptional and mundane. It's exceptional because ever stronger global anti-racist solidarity and local sovereign Black activism and theorising is demanding new political orders, from Brisbane to Minneapolis to Brixton to Palestine. In turn, neoliberal backlash enacts open warfare between those seeking to transform possessive patriarchal white sovereignty, as Professor Eileen Morton-Robinson terms it, that has wrought so much violence across the globe, and those willing to destroy the world rather than endure a future without this sovereignty and this authority, as political theorist Wendy Brown terms it. This place was formed in an awareness that it's not a time to be silent or to refuse to take sides, and that the war that is raging is violent in both an intellectual and a physical sense. And the fight is in the streets. It's led by the families of those who die in police custody, by those who fight for care from a health system designed to let Indigenous people die, and by Aboriginal children surviving in jails and out of home care. But in the same way, we can understand this as an exceptional moment. It is also, as our Indigenous colleagues and colleagues of colour know, just another moment. As Professor Wadigo would say, just another day in the colony in an unbroken, suffocating history of colonial and racial violence. So this moment demands our attention, this sort of endless moment, I suppose, but looking away and refusing to respond is precisely what so many of us as non-Indigenous people in this place continue to do. And this is reflected, I think, in the failure of so many of our academic institutions to respond to Black Lives Matter and to the ongoing demands of Indigenous sovereignty. And it was out of some of these failures that ICRR and Southside House emerged. Alyssa and I are deeply grateful to work in this space. It's a generative and collaborative space, but we don't speak on behalf of it. Today, we're speaking as two white women who have worked together and thought together for more than a decade, grappling with a range of questions about colonialism, racism, and complicity. So this means our reality is one of benefiting from and being implicated in the structures that enact the violence I've just talked about, and embodying that violence in our own being. And I use the language of our to refer to Alyssa and I when we're talking about colonial institutions and colonial processes, to try to locate ourselves in our complicity and connection to those, but certainly not to presume that everyone who's watching or joining is in the same location, and I hope not to exclude from the kind of conversation with that language. So politically, psychologically, and institutionally, we're continually reinscribed into our place as authoritative white knowers. And in academic spaces, this involves a particular virtue position that is always available to us as white women testifying to Indigenous suffering. And this is a simple fact, though stating it often becomes a lament or it becomes a performance of our own transcendence of these dynamics. But one of the foundational challenges that Alyssa and I have continued to wrestle with, and that I want to start from today, is the question of solidarity from a place of complicity. What does it mean to act in solidarity from this position without first spending all our political efforts trying to escape that complicity, or perhaps even more dangerously, to reconfigure our attempts to escape from complicity as solidarity, when they may in fact do the opposite. Chelsea Watergo, in her work Another Day in the Colony, raises the question of how to make a colonising people less colonising, and the deep challenge of that work. So Alyssa and I are thinking without definitive answers about what we might need to do, what we might need to invest in and disinvest in, build or dismantle, to be less colonising and do less harm here and now in confrontation with this moment, sort of on the daily, rather than in any sort of durative or solid sense. So it's this question that has brought us back to this theme that I'm going to talk to you about today, which we use this opportunity and this very generous invitation to think about the trajectory and landscape of our work together. And Alyssa and I have often used our work together to build on and think about and reflect on the bigger political questions that come up for us out of the kind of more focused policy-centred work and the collaborative, other collaborative work that we do. So one thing that we noticed as a preoccupation throughout our work, and that we want to talk about today, is the question of settler time and the question of political temporalities, that is the mobilisation of time as a political technique. And specifically, we want to talk about the colonial claim to the future as one of the foundational political techniques that colonialism uses. And today we want to reflect on the way that our preoccupation with our own futures as legitimate, reconciled, innocent, virtuous, or on solid ground in this place can work to defer demands to orient ourselves to Indigenous sovereignty in this moment, on this day, and to contribute to the material struggles that Indigenous people are engaged with right now. We acknowledge the transformative work that's being done both at Melbourne Uni and elsewhere by Indigenous scholars who are working on Indigenous futures and Indigenous futurity. We use this as a point to reflect on why that work is so destabilising and transformative, why the Indigenous claim to the future does so much political work, and to think about the way that settler futures continue to crowd out or try to take up oxygen from Indigenous defined and led futures. The settler claim to own and have authority over the future is a foundationally colonial claim, and one that's constantly fractured by the endurance of Indigenous sovereignty here and now. So we've shifted from dismantling settler futures, which is a pretty kind of definitive claim, to talk about decentering or disinvesting in settler futures. So, sorry, let me move my screen. And when talking about this work on Indigenous futurity and the importance of the Indigenous sovereign claim to the future, I'd just like to start with this quote that comes from this article where Dr. Lilla Watson said that we see our future stretching out as far in front of us as it does behind us. Overall, we suggest that the unrecognised investment in colonial defined futures actually suffuses the settler approach to many different areas of political encounter. That is in policy, in political debates, in academic work, and in progressive allyship. The settler future is taken to be both the most urgent political consideration and at the same time as somehow inevitable, foreclosing other futures. And this investment doesn't just shape our thinking about future possibilities. We suggest that it shapes our orientation to now. It provides a way of slipping out of the present and its demands on us into an imagined resolved future. And at the same time, the inevitability of that future legitimizes intensive and violent work in the present in order to prepare for it in the name of that future. We can avoid confronting the political demands Indigenous sovereignty makes on us in this moment. At the same time, we contribute to harmful patterns of intervention and denial, justified in terms of preparing us all for a legitimate future in which settlers will belong. So we acknowledge the really important and increasing focus of Indigenous scholars on the question of political temporalities in colonial time, including, of course, the foundational work of Tuck and Yang, who directly consider the relationship between settler innocence and settler futures. We don't claim to offer something beyond this work, but to think with it more directly in the spaces we know and occupy, which are especially the spaces of Australian Indigenous policy and the spaces of white progressive allyship. We begin by reviewing and extending our work on the temporality of colonial sovereignty and think about how it's always disrupted by the endurance of Indigenous sovereignty. And on the basis of this, the impossibility of colonial sovereignty's claim to the future in the face of Indigenous sovereignty as the resilient existent, as still here, to use the protest slogan that is so disruptive to those settler claims on the future. And then we consider the mechanisms of fantasy, the investment in the settler future, which fantasy as a political mechanism in violent political orders that allows us to inhabit the paradoxes of our own position without ever fully confronting them, at the same time as we seek to make our fantasies, which we acknowledge to be not real, into reality. And then briefly, we look at the role of settler futurity in our claims to innocence, which is a form of political subjectivity that Alyssa's particularly worked on. She uses the term colonising white innocence, building on Watego, Langton, Morton Robinson, Baldwin, Wecker, and Tuck and Yang. Innocence makes it possible to assume that we are always the agents of progressive futurity, even when we are in real time involved in violently clearing the ground around us to maintain that space of innocence. And finally, and quite briefly, we reflect on what that might mean for those of us seeking to enact solidarity from a position of complicity. That part we'd originally imagined as a conversation between Alyssa and I to indicate its open, I suppose, and unfinished nature. Unfortunately, because Alyssa's not able to be here, I'm just going to present, and I think I'll try to capture the openness of the conversations that we have, but it will inevitably feel more like a set of claims, and really look forward to the conversation that comes after this. So to start with the question of settler sovereignty, and I'm using here a public artwork that's publicly available by Stephen Paul Judd, who is a Kiowa and Choctaw artist, who also uses the language of still here and acknowledges the power of that present disruption. Sorry, I have to keep moving around my screen so I can see what's on the slides. Start with this quote: "The futures of some, or the hopes that they have for their future, can never be a future. They can only drag others back into the past. And for others, no matter what harms they do, the truth of these harms is deferred into the future. What is happening isn't happening because it is what will have been." And that is from Elizabeth Povinelli's work. She talks about the technologies of temporality, especially in the neoliberal world, in economies of abandonment. Alyssa and I, coming from political science, have always used the language and framing of sovereignty, and used that in a hopefully contested and plural way, in order to think through the dynamics both of colonial Western-derived sovereignty, but to locate that in the same contested space of jurisdiction and authority as the enduring reality of Indigenous sovereignty, which is derived from very different ontologies and relationships. So these are two very different phenomenon, and yet they encounter each other in a very violent conflict conditioned by the nature of colonial sovereignty. So colonial sovereignty, as Professor Morton Robinson has stated, is a theological and theocratic form of political power. Despite the fact that it's secularized in the Enlightenment, and that kind of power no longer was understood as flowing from God at the top, but instead rising up from the people, it continued to have the same set of hierarchical institutions, the same claim to unified, undivided, authoritative and singular authority over a particular territory. So that sovereign power in the colonial sense always flows down from above, despite the kind of reconfiguration of that as no longer a theological or cultural phenomenon. This means colonial sovereignty is possessive white sovereignty. It makes a fundamental claim to own the future because its jurisdiction cannot be divided. So it refuses the possibility of sharing that future in any ongoing way. It's animated by its own imperatives to establish itself as unified, authoritative, and legitimate. But it's in an endless process of fixing and refixing this possession in the face of a persistent Indigenous sovereignty that disrupts its claims and stops it from being what it claims to be. As Alyssa and I have argued elsewhere, this means that sovereignty, colonial sovereignty, is actually a performance claiming to be an essence, unlike Indigenous sovereignty, which is the resilient existent, which is as fact. This means its being has always been premised on the non-existence, destruction, or erasure of Indigenous sovereignty, and it's never fully existed in the form it claims for itself, completed, natural, God-given. Instead, its reality is the performance of that authority and a constant hunger, driven by the threat of Indigenous sovereignty to continually assert its own. And in that sense, it is in its nature politically possessive and violent. Following Irene Watson, we've looked at the way that colonial sovereignty pursues and assumes a vanishing endpoint, some moment of completion that seems to lurk in our, as in colonial, imaginations, policy projects, and political debates. And this is often configured as the moment of decolonisation, or at least the conceptual confusion around that serves certain purposes, But actually, in many cases, we suggest it is actually the moment of colonial completion or full colonisation, because this vanishing endpoint or colonial goal is the moment where the conflictual and disruptive coexistence of more than one political sovereignty in a place will finally be resolved, reconciled, and the settler state will assume its natural God-given authority over this place. So this transformative event is both an impossible political dream, impossible because of the existence of Indigenous sovereignty, and a concrete political project that justifies all manner of behaviour in the present. And really significantly, this Western temporal narrative and the claim to Western futurity or settler futurities maps onto another Western imaginary, which is the story of the social contract and the entry into sovereignty, which is the moment in liberal imaginations that a group of people transition from a collective social status, from being defined by their position in a society, into individualized freedom, into contractual personhood, and into political statehood. So it's a movement out of a constraining history into a liberated and sovereign and rational present. As Norm Sheehan, Lyndon Murphy and Barry Hindus argue, liberalism consigns Indigenous contemporaries to its own past, even as they exist in the present, and imagines this location in the past to be some sort of moral and intellectual and political failure, revealing the incapacity and disinclination of Indigenous people to enter into that social contract and join the present. Therefore, the movement through time, this radical transformative moment of completion, is also mapped onto and tracks this imagined colonial projection onto Indigenous people, a developmental movement from incapacity to capacity. And in our work on policy, this is where we have particularly looked at, obviously, capacity building. The question of capacity and incapacity is a central question in current configurations of Indigenous policy. One really clear example that we've talked about is the Northern Territory intervention, where the language of sovereignty was actually used very directly to talk about the Hobbesian nightmare of dysfunction in which Indigenous people existed, and the need to make Indigenous people more like normal suburbs with intensive, coercive, controlling intervention. But this is just one obvious and telling policy moment. The same logic is captured in other ways, in more technical ways, in Closing the Gap, which is a ongoing kind of more technical project about how to address Indigenous deficit and bring Indigenous people into the benefits of a settler future defined as like us. So just to briefly mention, one thing that we've been thinking about in relation to Indigenous policy and the question of politics is the question of the constant settler deferral of political encounter as not yet, that we're not yet ready for that encounter, and yet policy making, which is understood as the work to prepare us for that encounter, especially, of course, to prepare Indigenous people, is always now, it's always urgent, it always needs to be done before we can spend a great deal of time thinking about it. Because as Watson and other Indigenous scholars have observed, that future never arrives. That political moment, it recedes over the horizon without losing its power to authorise violence and colonial action in the present. And this is the most powerful political payoff of the colonial claim to futurity. The question of Indigenous capacity and action upon it is at heart a racial question. It has a particularly long history in colonial Australia because, as Arabina and others have shown, it is ultimately a European assessment of Indigenous capacity, a racialised assessment that frames terra nullius and the denial of Indigenous sovereignty in the first place. So as Professor Watergo says, Indigenous people here occupier places, both First Nations and First Race. The question of capacity, as critical legal scholar Desmond Manderson argues, in relation to the always deferred promise of political inclusion and the rule of law, is always a promise in future tense. The promise is meant seriously, but it's a promise exclusively in future tense. We do believe in your potential for equality and sameness. It is as if Governor Arthur had said to the first Tasmanians. We look forward to the moment when you will consent peaceably to our governance. But until the conditions of sameness and equality are met, all bets are off. So the promise of Indigenous respect, interaction and encounter is not so much denied as endlessly deferred, and in its place comes unilateral intensive policy work to reform Indigenous life in line with visions of legitimate subjectivity. Therefore, the technical and the political work together to foreclose political encounter in the durative present, which becomes wholly concerned with policy detail. And this is one example of that constant deferral and the risk of entering into politics as always something that the colonial state is never ready for, which is Turnbull's response to the Uluru Statement of the Heart, saying it's undesirable, it's risky, there's no guidance. And perhaps the most future tense statement in this space that I've ever heard, the coalition continues to aim to work in a bipartisan way to support constitutional recognition. Still that claim on the future. Yet this claim of not yet is met always with the reality of still here. That Indigenous sovereignty is, as Professor Wadigo says, in the being. And always was, always will be is a phrase that collapses the long past of Indigenous sovereignty into the present and into its necessary future. While colonial sovereignty may claim that future, it's in fact a fragile and impossible project that can never be what it says it is. So then the question becomes, how does this settler claim to the future maintain itself in the face of its continual fracturing in the ongoing reality of Indigenous sovereignty and its own impossibility? I just wanted to use this quote to talk about Chelsea's work on hope as a psychological tool of the coloniser, and the way that that claim and future promise also works to make demands of Indigenous people. So one concept that we've used to try to think through this paradox, the impossibility of colonial sovereignty on the one hand, and its constant, endless, violent work to make that reality real on the other, is the notion of fantasy. And this book is a book from my own youth, as my family background is Jewish, and I've therefore have a kind of double colonial inheritance, I suppose, as I confront the reality of Zionism as well as the role of the violence of the Holocaust in my own family. But I often come back to this book, and I will at the very end, as a manifestation of that question of colonial fantasy and the enjoyment that we get from it. So we suggest that settler colonial systems offer white colonisers a complex and insidious set of tools that we might call political fantasy. There's something about fantasy that collapses the distinction between political stories and political realities, and allows us to continually escape from one world into another. Gerald Cider, in his work on fantasy, says Europeans create a fantasy of what Indigenous people are like and then act towards them as they fantasize. Within this domain of fantasy, which quickly encompasses visions of domination, the Europeans insist on a fundamental restructuring of what they see and hear. So fantasy is different from simple misrecognition of reality. It's an act of will that's both quite delusional about that reality, but immensely practical about changing that reality, and very strategic. It doesn't just pretend the world is a particular way, it insists that it is that way and then seeks to go about making it that way. This means the fantasizer somewhere acknowledges that what they claim to be true is not yet true, but in their act of willing and intensively desiring that alternative reality, do everything they can to bring that about. And there's an enjoyment to be had in the occupation of fantasy, as you would know from the concept of fantasy itself. We know something's not real, but in acting as if it is real, we derive pleasure from our suspension of disbelief. So fantasy is dangerous in this sense politically because it thrives on contradiction. Misrecognition might, for example, use the reality of Indigenous sovereignty, which fractures its fantasy, to correct itself and come to a more full understanding of reality, whereas fantasy will use that confrontation with a contradictory reality to more intensively pursue its desires, while refusing to acknowledge that those desires aren't realised. So I think Povinelli gets to some of the question of settler innocenting of the harms that we do in the present because it's already justified by the fantasy of the political future of what we will become. And interestingly, the explicit language of political fantasy is used in a number of violent political orders. So it's used in the language of settler colonists. Theodore Herzl, as one of the founding Zionists, this phrase, which is often circulated in Israel, which is actually on a t-shirt my parents brought me back, if you will it, it's no dream, right? We can make something real just by willing it. And I came across this recently in another context, the immense investment in myth and fantasy in fascist regimes, right? As a kind of, it's to this myth, to this grandeur we wish to translate into a complete reality, we subordinate all the rest. And I don't make that comparison lightly or necessarily say there's many equivalences, but our suggestion is that there's a violent political ordering that is enabled by fantasy. So the fundamental fantasy is that we can somehow, as settlers, actually possess Indigenous land and actually dispossess Indigenous people. And even some of the most critical political settler work sometimes configures colonisation as if it's just not yet there, that it has not yet occupied, extinguished Indigenous sovereignty. But this is the ultimate error of colonial thinking itself, as both Irene Watson and Professor Morton Robinson tells us, that there is no mechanism for extinguishment of Indigenous relationship and connection to land. It is alien to Indigenous ontologies, says Professor Watson. There's no rule that would enable the extinguishment of our law or the extinguishment of our relationships. We can't hand over that authority. And Professor Morton Robinson says that the crucial point is not that sovereignty is not ceded, but that it cannot be ceded. She says, the life force of sovereignty is in every Aboriginal person. It's in the land, it's of the land, and it cannot be killed. White people and what they have is surface. You are surface people. We are part in and of the land. You can put on our country anything you like, but we and the land remain sovereign. So fantasy nonetheless allows us to invest in that impossible future and continue to act violently as if this future is inevitable. It offers us tools to look away from our violence or to reconfigure it as benevolent but difficult work. And in this sense, it's a fundamental tool of innocence that reconfigures our violence in the now as kind of difficult work duty that weighs upon us. To use some of the ideas from Arendt, acknowledging that while she had really critical insights into the operation of Nazi ideology, did not apply those to situations involving non-white people. But she says of the Nazis, they issued stock phrases to people to allow them to deny their own violence, so that instead of saying what horrible things I did to people, the murderers would be able to say what horrible things I had to watch in the pursuit of my own duties, how heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders. And after a while, these slogans no longer needed to be issued from above, but became stock phrases, self-fabricated by people. So she says that the feeling of innocence doesn't make you innocent. In fact, in conditions of aggregate harm, the pursuit of innocence or the pretense of innocence might be the most violent political work of all. So I think I'm probably running out of time. So I just want to end with that question of innocence as a foundational racial and colonial strategy. One that we've looked at particularly in relation to the discipline of political science and its claims to innocence and its claim to own the political future, but which also operates obviously in a range of different spaces. And James Baldwin argued in 1970 that racism operates through the active production of innocence. The will of the people in America has always been at the mercy of an innocence, not just sacred, but sacredly cultivated, which connects to work on the broader epistemologies of unknowing that serve colonial domination. So in progressive terms, we suggest the settler wish for a beautiful revolutionary future is itself innocenting and might be just as dominating as the wish for a beautiful national future. And this is the page from the book that I want to end with, which in a very visceral and material way shows that movement of fantasy. All the material work that is done to transform Palestinian land into soft and moist ground with evenly spaced rows ready to be planted with seedlings. The hard work of colonisers in the present, which is all justified in the name of the big and strong and beautiful forest that will come in the future. So the last thing I want to say is then the question becomes, how do we decenter settler futures in our imagination, institutions and practices as settler people? It's led us to think about solidarity as necessarily a temporary practice that has to be preoccupied with the here and now, rather than a position we can occupy that places us in a space of innocence. It means bracketing the question of what about us? Where do we go? Do we stay? Do we go? A question always framed in terms of the colonial imagination of either success or failure, colonial completion or colonial abandonment, and may help us to begin to see the Indigenous sovereignty right in front of us and confront some of the violent harms we engaged in perpetrating now, which means starting with relationship and contributing to struggles that are not defined by us and which the settler place in the future is neither the starting nor the ending question. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Liz. What a deeply stimulating presentation that was. We've got a few minutes for questions from the audience. We don't have any in the chat at the moment, but please, if you type quickly, we might just get a couple of questions to Liz in. But I'll start with your ending point. I'm conscious that in a lot of the teaching I'm currently doing, particularly in the treaty education program at the moment, how much that discomfort that you note at the end of your presentation is reflected back to me. Not always as a negative, but that, participants in this education where we're asking them to confront the reality of unceded Indigenous sovereignties, of multiple sovereignties having always existed in this place, and that being the starting point for thinking about treaty rather than some other notion of liberal recognition. These are challenging ideas for people who have been embedded, particularly public servants, embedded in the notion of the rightness of their place to make policy for, about, in the best interests of Indigenous peoples, which, from your own work has been a really dominant dominant narrative, a dominant piece of rhetoric and discourse. Do you have thoughts on how we can best help settler peoples of all kinds sit in that discomfort? That, you know, there is that desire always, it's very evident in your work, to kind of rush to that moment of feeling good again, to, you know, to claim legitimacy, to claim innocence, to situate ourselves as separate from or better than or different from the majority. How do we help people sit in the deep discomfort that your work provokes and others?
Thanks, Sarah. Really challenging question, and obviously one that, as someone who works in this space, a non-Indigenous person, and as a teacher in this space, that comes up all the time. And I think it is a necessarily fracturing experience, an uncomfortable experience to be decentered. And that is one of the fundamental things that happens to non-Indigenous people who are used to being authoritative knowers in this space. But I sometimes think we're prepared to tolerate that up to a point if we imagine it as some sort of singular act of transcendence that we can get to the other side of, and on that other side will then be okay again. One of the things that I actually have found very useful is this question always of the focus being on Indigenous struggles right now, Indigenous relationships right now. How are we orienting ourselves to Indigenous sovereignty that exists right now, rather than staying always in that question of what do I do, what does it mean for me, which is precisely maybe what moving away from our preoccupation with our own futures does, is it allows us to just stay in the now, where some of those questions are really clear, what it would look like to engage in solidarity with contemporary struggles.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question that's come in from the audience. Someone asks, how do we bring together focusing on what you've called struggles not defined by us with the kind of funding mechanisms and expectations in academia? How do we work with those ideas in these spaces?
That is such a difficult question, and it is a lot of the reason that ICRR and Southside House exists, because universities are fundamentally colonial institutions in a bunch of ways, as many of you would know, and there is a constant recuperation into the dynamics, and there's been a real freedom, I've found, from sitting on the margins of those spaces and finding ways to do research that isn't oriented towards the imperatives of academic institutions, but instead can be driven by demands of those engaging in community struggle, but setting up that place and acting in that place theoretically and intellectually is very hard, but it's incredibly generative because so much of the theorising that's excluded from the academy is actually happening in activist spaces. So, very good question.
Thank you. We've got 2 minutes, so you might not get to answer this question properly, but I'll throw it at you anyway. So Patricia asks, since there's no comparison between Western/colonial sovereignty and Indigenous or First Nation sovereignty, why is there always a comparison from the non-Indigenous people, especially in settler decoloniality? I think the question is about why are settlers always reaching for an equivalence between our ideas of sovereignty in this place and Indigenous sovereignties?
And I think the part of the problem that we identify is in the fundamentally unilateral and comprehensive and exhaustive claim of sovereignty itself, that it always necessarily needs to be unified and complete. And so one of the things that happens is that all other forms of political life, ordering, jurisdiction are rendered in terms that are understood in terms of settler sovereignty, and that can therefore be used, traded, exchanged, absorbed, extinguished in a way that Western sovereignty imagines political power can be. So But despite that, the language of sovereignty is obviously a really important kind of suturing point in the conflict. It's something that's claimed by Indigenous people and by settler people because it speaks to that foundational question of jurisdiction, which makes it a really important space of struggle, I think.
That is an excellent note to end on. We have another question we won't try to get to, but we'll get you all these questions, Liz, in case you want to respond offline. Thank you, Elizabeth Strakosch, for joining us and presenting your work and Alyssa's work. It's been a really thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation that I'm sure people will reflect on for some time. It's always a joy and a privilege to have the opportunity to engage with your work. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you everyone who's been with us online. We had well over 100 people join us today. So thank you to every single person. We will see you again for our next webinar next month. I, of course, can't pull up the date this moment, but you are all on our mailing list and we will no doubt remind you, and we will look forward to having you with us for the rest of the Critical Public Conversation series this year. Thank you very much, everyone, and goodbye.
Thanks.